Okay, welcome back. Recording this episode from the home office. And let's just do a quick review of what we covered yesterday. So, yesterday we framed Marxism in terms of two parallel traditions concerning science. And we discussed how one tradition was pre-modern and was continued by Hegel, and the other was modern and finalized, actually, in terms of the fundamental conception by Descartes. There were some precursors to this. You had Newton, you had Francis Bacon. We didn't discuss that last time, but I'm sure they'll come up. But really, Descartes, there are two main works by Descartes. I'm just going to look these up, because one of them is the essay concerning the method, which I described, and the other one has to do with his skepticism project and what came of that, which is the conclusion that the subject is the fundamental thing in analysis and not the object. Let's see. Major works by Descartes. Okay, Meditations on First Philosophy, right. So Discourse on the Method, that's where he breaks down things into their component parts. You analyze the component parts through means of measurement, which gives you clear and distinct understanding of component parts, and then from there you reconstruct the whole and you have a better understanding of the whole according to his conception, which really you're losing meaning by doing that, but you're getting extremely detailed and exact information on within particular contexts related to that. So for example, if you want to understand something from a scientific point of view, if you want to be able to manipulate something from a technological point of view, then you use Descartes' method to get highly exact factual information about it. But it has nothing to do with the meaning behind it. It has nothing to do with any sort of big picture understanding. It just strictly has to do with a factual understanding of particular aspects of the thing that's being studied, as opposed to the more ancient understanding of Scientia, which is sort of getting to the meaning of things, the first principles of things, trying to understand the essence of things, right? That's more so the old tradition. Descartes is the new tradition. Hegel continues the old tradition but doesn't really confront Descartes. Marx is within the Hegelian tradition. Heidegger actually confronts the Cartesian tradition for the first time in a really major way. Okay, let's see. What else did we talk about? We talked about Marxism as following a materialist dialectic that mirrors Hegel's spiritual dialectic. And we briefly touched on how the way Haas lays out the relationship between the party and society as being analogous to the subject versus the object within the understanding of Heidegger's Dasein. So if you take Heidegger's Dasein, you have the subject and you have the object, and the two together create something that has meaning. Apart from each other, neither one of them has meaning. Together they create meaning. They create Dasein. So the relationship between the party and society is analogous in some way to the relationship between the subject and the object. Okay. And then finally we talked about how Marxism is not an ideology. Marxism is a method. So when we say that Marxism is a science, we mean also that it is not an ideology. So it is a science as opposed to an ideology. It's a science in that it creates a kind of a method. So in that sense, what we're doing here, because there really wasn't a standardized method for science before Descartes. And then Descartes created a method for understanding things, and then this created the modern scientific revolution. Whereas before, there was this pursuit of knowledge, and everyone had their own take on it. Now here, using Hegel and Marx, we're creating an alternative method, an alternative scientific method that is more in line with the medieval understanding of science as the pursuit of knowledge and first principles, versus the modern understanding of deriving facts about the object that we're studying rather than getting at the meaning of it. Okay. So that's what we discussed yesterday, so we're just going to pick up from there. Without the guidance of proletarian consciousness, the movement propelling society still continues. But it leads to an economic, political, spiritual, moral, and overall social crisis. Society eats away at itself as it cannot make sense of the contradictions driving it. So here he's describing the dialectical process and the way that it plays out without the working class direct participation in it. And the reason for this is not because the working class is the working class. It's not, what's the word I'm looking for? I always forget this word. It's not arbitrary that it's the working class. The reason it has to be the working class is, and he'll allude to this later on as well, but the reason it has to be the working class is because the working class is that class of people that is responsible for reproducing the way of life of that society. So in that way, they're fundamental to the design of that society, the way of being of that society. So if the people engaged in creating the meaning of society don't engage in the dialectical process, then the conflict between the thesis and the antithesis destroys society, because society as such is not participating in that process. So it's becoming destroyed by the process instead of shaping it. The crisis of Western Marxism lies in its inability to overcome the subject-object distinction when it comes to society. How can society both be a real, material object while also given the quality of subjective responsibility? So again, this gets back to this idea where you have Descartes, who sees the subject as fundamental. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, later on he'll get into, say, not Leibniz, but Spinoza. I think he'll make if I remember correctly, he'll make the case that Spinoza is object fundamentalism. So society has to be both the subject and the object, right, in order to have a meaningful existence, right? So he's alluding back to that. Two responses emerge to the question of how can society be a real material object while also given the quality of subjective responsibility. The first scope of Western Marxism is a type of fatalism which Lenin calls economism. According to this view, politics is not involved in the revolutionary transformation of society at all, which happens only because of economics or a spontaneous uprising of the proletariat. Okay. So, in other words, he's describing a view in which economic forces are fundamental, but the political process has very little to do with it. So, if you ever hear someone talk about, oh, well, the president really doesn't have any power, it's really just, you know, chaos that just kind of happens, I think that's sort of in line with this sort of view. The second, more relevant, is the opposite extreme. In this view, society must act as a pure subject in the form of institutions, party or otherwise, exterminating every trace of its preconscious and objective material being. Recreating all society from scratch. I'm going to read that again. In this view, society must act as a pure subject in the form of institutions, exterminating every trace of its preconscious and objective material being, recreating all society from scratch. There's a lot there. There's a lot in that statement. So, pure subject. So, in other words, you're talking about a pure subject that can ignore the objective material reality and just remake it from scratch. This is definitely the attitude of academia. This is definitely the attitude of the Western elites, or Baal-ites, as I like to call them, because they're worshippers of Baal. And according to the religion of Baal, Baal overcomes God, which is El. And so when they describe themselves as elites, they're enthroning Baal, because they're saying, oh, well, we are the chosen of God. But by God, they don't mean El, they mean Baal, who has overthrown God. That's their view. So anytime you call them elites, you are acknowledging their premise that Baal has overthrown God. So I refuse to call them elites. I call them Baal-ites. They're Baal-ites, 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 whatever you want to call them, but they're worshippers of the rebel against God. They're illegitimate. But along with this philosophy, this is actually very in line with that idea, because that philosophy says, well, we can overthrow God. If you say that you can ignore material reality and make it from scratch, that is tantamount to saying that you're going to overthrow God. If you are a humble person before God, you don't ignore the material reality, you don't ignore the real situation, you work within the real situation. You're humbled before it, you accept it. So this is part of that philosophy. So anytime you have these people where it's like, oh, well, there's no human nature, oh, well, it doesn't matter what people say because we can just, this whole sort of, who was Freud's relation nephew, who was like that big marketeer. Freud's nephew, marketing. Edward Bernays. So this sort of philosophy, Edward Bernays type philosophy, it's like, oh, well, I can just manipulate it directly, so it doesn't really matter what material reality is. That's sort of Edward Bernays' outlook. That is a Baal-ite outlook. The sort of crisper of the fundamental reality. Right? So. And preconscious. So it says exterminating every trace of its preconscious. The preconscious is a Freudian term. So according to Freud, there are the three parts of the person: there was the ego, the id, the ego, and the superego. And then there were the three levels of consciousness. So there was the conscious mind, the preconscious mind, and the unconscious mind. The preconscious mind was that part of the mind where, if you were paying attention and were self-aware, you could see it's not entirely conscious, but you can detect it if you're paying attention. That's the preconscious mind. So right before like you actually like engage with it mentally, it's preconscious. And then once you engage with it mentally, then it's conscious, right? So what's preconscious is sort of what's accessible to you, but what you haven't engaged with mentally yet. And in order to reshape society according to the way you want to do it, you can't do that without destroying mankind's access to the preconscious. Because it's one long line of bullshit. So if a man has access to his preconscious, he'll smell the bullshit. So there's no way to do what these elites are trying to do, without destroying the preconscious. Man's ego, man's id is mostly unconscious, right? It's just the desires that you have in the moment. You're not conscious of them until they're manifest. You don't know where they came from. They're just there, right? They're just urges. You're hungry. You're thirsty. You want to have sex. That's the id, right? The ego cuts across the conscious mind, the preconscious mind, and the unconscious mind. So you're in control to a certain extent over your ego, right? Because you can kind of, because there's a feedback loop between your consciousness and your ego, where it's like, what do I want and why? So you kind of interact with your ego in sort of like a direct way. But it's not all conscious, because a lot of it, like a lot of your, it's like your ego touches your lizard brain because it's looking out for you, right? You don't always know why. You don't always know what the thinking is, but it's looking out for you, right? And so because it's doing that, it cuts across your lizard brain, your mammalian brain, and your higher lobe, right? And in Freudian terms, it cuts across your conscious mind, your unconscious mind, your preconscious mind, and then your superego. In basic terms, is your conscience, but it gets complicated. But if you think of it as the conscience, you won't be too far off as far as the superego. It's your sense of right and wrong. Freud thinks that it's basically socialized. I would say that's probably not entirely accurate. Like, it's probably partially accurate, but not entirely. But that's a whole other subject. But anyway, so when he says that the institutions have to exterminate the preconscious in order to act as a pure subject, what he's saying is they want to take their view of reality and force it on material reality. And in doing so, they have to destroy your access to the preconscious at scale. What I mean by at scale, not just you, but of everyone within society. Right? Moving on. But both two sides of Western Marxism, so the fatalism and then the subjectivism, are incompatible with Marx's Promethean gesture of suspending knowledge back to being. So again, he's talking about overcoming and moving beyond the sort of Cartesian revolution, where knowledge isn't this sort of extracted factual knowledge. There still is that extracted factual knowledge, but now we're bringing it back to this sort of conversation about meaning, And that's what Marxism is about, because it goes back to that tradition of scientia, right, as opposed to the Cartesian method. Right. In the first, so the fatalistic one, being is upheld entirely independent of knowledge. So in other words, the political process has no control over over what happens. The dog came in. I lost my train of thought. All right. All right. Go to your mom. Go to your mom. I'm busy. That's enough. That's enough. Go to your mom. Go to your mom. Good boy. Where was I? Right. So we can't know what actually moves society, so therefore politics can't have sort of a controlling function of any kind. Right. That's the first extreme. In the first, being is upheld entirely independent of knowledge. So being is sort of like the chaos that just kind of happens because of economics or because of spontaneous actions of the proletariat. Right? It's beyond our knowledge. In the second, knowledge is asserted over and at the expense of being. So that's that whole thing with institutions overriding the preconscious and trying to remake society from scratch. If society will become communist independently of the engaged subjective partisanship of communists, then all you have is the conceit of some subject in the know passively watching their object fulfill the expectations of subjective knowledge. So here he's starting to get into the Spinozist view, where basically there's a kind of determinism, right? There's a kind of determinism where there's really not anything that you can do to make it happen or not. And I'll admit, like, this has more so been where I have come from more so than the second one, and it's not correct, but it's easy to feel that way sometimes because you can kind of see where things are going, but you feel kind of powerless to change them, right? And so you just kind of sit back and watch it happen. Maybe invest some money because you know what's going to happen. You know what I mean? You know, get rich off of it. You can't change the outcome, but you can get rich off of it, right? So you have the subjective knowledge of what's happening, but there's no sort of political process that you can do to sort of change the outcome, right? As opposed to, if communism is just some enlightened consciousness, then what you have are psychotic subjects devoid of any trust that their knowledge is actually based in non-conscious reality itself, denouncing the latter as reactionary. That's right. So, this is how you get this contradiction, where communism is supposed to be about the working class, right? And then you have all these intellectual Baal-ites decrying the MAGA Republicans, who are the working class, right? So it's like this enlightened consciousness, and they're calling the actual proletariat reactionary. Knowledge only as subjective self-consciousness, right? So that's that whole hyper-individualism, right? Where, oh, well, you can't be communist unless, you know, you're down with like the latest acronym for LGBTQIZAI or whatever it is, right? So the praxis uniting thought and practice then is only in the fractal movement of subjective self-consciousness. Are you hungry or something? You thirsty? You want to go outside? It's cold out there. You want to go outside? Okay. All right. 1 second. All right, let's go outside. Whoa. Yeah, he's got to go outside. All right, I can get into it. It's so recording, right? Sorry for the interruption. Where were we? Right. The praxis uniting thought and practice then is only in the fractal movement of subjective self-consciousness. That is a complex statement. Let's take a look here. Okay, so the praxis uniting thought and practice. So because Marxism is a science, it's not enough to think of it in the abstract, you also have a practice, right? So then you take that fact and you apply it to this second category of Marxists, and the only thing it boils down to is this sort of hyper-individualization where everyone is their own gender and everyone has these little whims that have to be valid and validated, right? Voluntary action becomes the object of the subject, who then acts on its basis. Voluntary action. Okay. I think what that means is this sort of permissiveness that's kind of forced on society, right? So where this individual has to be allowed to do whatever they want and be whatever they want, and you have to not only let them do that, but you have to kind of play along. I think that's what he's referring to. Object takes on the processual quality of the yet to be filled subjectivity. Processual quality of yet to be filled subjectivity. Right. Right. So then, like, going back to this example of like a trans person, for instance, right? They may be biologically a man, right? They say that they're a woman. So the fact that they're a biological man, you can't acknowledge that they're a biological man because they're in the process of fulfilling their subjectivity. I think that's what he's saying. I think. Don't hold me to it. I don't know for sure, but I think that's what he's talking about. I think. All right, moving on. This is exactly why James Lindsay uses his Twitter tag there. Places Marxism in the Gnostic tradition. Okay. This Western interpretation of Marxism is founded upon a metaphysical distrust for reality. I like that. Man. I've already been going half an hour. There's so much to unpack there. How much do I want to get into that? I want to get to at least to the end of this sub-thread. Okay, there's one more. I'm going to read the next one, and then we'll kind of gauge how much time we have to get into that. Because of that distrust, good, virtue, etc., lies only in knowledge as pure subjective self-consciousness. I'm definitely going to unpack that here in a little bit, but just for a little bit. This Western Marxism has its origins in the neo-Kantian Georgy Lukács, whose seminal work History and Class Consciousness was written to resolve the problem the subject-object distinction posed for the Marxist concept of society, class, and history. Okay. That's as far as we're going to read today. I want to spend just a few minutes unpacking this paragraph number 20. I'm just going to read it again. This is why James Lindsay places Marxism in the Gnostic tradition. The Western interpretation of Marxism is founded upon a metaphysical distrust for reality. Now, Gnosticism is this idea that the physical reality is somehow fundamentally evil, that the material world. So, forgetting the name of that book again. Major works. Okay. So on Meditations in First Philosophy, Descartes describes the universe in a hypothetical way, as he's in this book he's being hypothetical, right? But I'm going to take that hypothetical example and I'm going to describe how that describes Gnosticism, because in Gnostics that's not hypothetical, that's actually how it is, right? This is what Gnostics actually believe, but what Descartes speaks about as sort of a hypothetical example, right? So in his sense of skepticism about what one can actually know, one objection to objective reality that he brings up is, well, what if God is evil? What if God is an evil trickster and the material reality is just one big joke, one big long deception, one big trick that God is playing on us humans? Right? And later on he goes on to say, oh, well, actually God probably isn't evil, so therefore we can assume that the physical reality is real, right? Even though it's not the fundamentally real thing, the subject is the fundamentally real thing. But he presents this as a possible objection. The Gnostics literally believe this, right? So, well, I don't want to generalize, because there's different schools of Gnosticism. But in ancient times, in the roots of the Gnostic movement, and many of them still believe this, there's this idea that there's this demiurge, right, that created the physical reality as a trap, as a prison for the human mind. This whole Matrix idea, right? The Matrix is a Gnostic film. So if you imagine a Matrix where reality is just this big computer program and you're trapped inside of it and you can't get out, that's more or less what the Gnostics believe. And so they think that the only good in the world is the subjective, not the objective. The objective is evil. Everything material, everything about the material reality is evil. Not just wrong, but evil, right? So this whole idea that you can overthrow reality, that you can overthrow God, right? Gnosticism is very much in line with that tradition of thinking. And that tradition of thinking, like I mentioned before, goes all the way back to Baal worship. That's where that started. If you read, what was the name of that book? the name of that book? Baal worship text discovered in Canaan. Okay. The Baal cycle, right. So, somewhat recently, they were performing some excavations in Canaan, well, now Palestine, right? They discovered the original religious text that the Baal worshippers used as their holy text. It was called the Baal cycle, right? And then the Baal cycle that describes this legend of Baal overthrowing El and becoming El himself, right? So that's where this is coming from a religious standpoint, from my perspective. And then Gnosticism, this idea of this evil demiurge that has us trapped here, right? In my view, that's more or less sort of along that sort of intellectual tradition. Right? So then if you accept that, then you have a metaphysical distrust of reality. So if a man says he's a woman, who are you to question that? Who are you to question that? The subject is prior to the object. And the object itself, the material object, that's evil. So you have to ignore that. The subject automatically supersedes that, according to this line of thinking, right? So because of that distrust, good, virtue, etc., lies only in the knowledge as pure, subjective self-consciousness. And literally every time I see, not the rainbow flag as much, because that's mostly just, gay people wanting to, not be oppressed because of their gayness. That's whatever, doesn't really fit me. That new one that has like the sideways triangle on it, that's progressing that to sort of like a pure subjectivity. Where it's not enough that you have to like be okay with people having their preferences, but now you have to play along when people want their subjective understanding of themselves to trump material reality. That's evil. That is evil. That is related to the worship of Baal. All right. That's enough for today. We'll pick it up again. Probably not tomorrow. I'm going to take tomorrow off. I usually take one day a week to just completely relax and zone out. But maybe Wednesday, we'll see. If I get a chance. Till then.